Warren, it appears to me that an underlying element of negotiations is conflict. Without conflict, the need for negotiations wouldn't arise. Are there some new ways of looking at conflict that seem to be emerging in our society?
Well, it seems to me there's one very important and subtle shift that has occurred in the last few years. If you look at the literature up until about 10, 15 years ago, dealing with conflict, most of it dealt with how to avoid conflict, how to prevent conflict, and how to resolve conflict. The assumption being that conflict is basically a bad thing. Now, I think we have a more neutral attitude toward conflict. That is, we are saying, in effect, conflict is a very powerful process. It changes things, and it can change things either for the better or the worse. It can lead to either creative or destructive outcomes depending on how it's managed. And so the emphasis increasingly is on how to understand conflict and how to manage it as a powerful human process.
Those were the opening minutes of my interview with Dr. Warren Schmidt, a professor at the University of Southern California's School of Public Administration and a nationally known consultant for over 20 years on the management of conflict in both public and private organizations. If conflict is always present in negotiations, it's important to understand its impact. But it's been only recently that we are starting to systematically and scientifically gain an understanding of conflict and its role in the dynamics of negotiations. Or to put it in Dr. Schmidt's words, how to manage conflict as a powerful human process. We will examine the following dimensions of conflict, its impact on the dynamics of negotiations, and how what we know about conflict can help us gain negotiating leverage. First, what types of conflicts are triggered during negotiations, and what generates these conflicts? Second, do conflicts follow a certain pattern? And if so, where in that pattern can a negotiator gain leverage to manage the conflict? And third, what alternative strategies can we use to negotiate conflict? Dr. Schmidt raised the point that conflict should be seen as inevitable and perhaps even desirable. If that's true, then it's important to recognize the presence of a certain level of conflict in negotiations as having some beneficial aspects and not something to be automatically suppressed. I asked Warren to give us examples of the effects of conflict, both negative and positive.
Well, if you think about some of the conflicts you have been involved in or you've observed, the negative effects are fairly clear. It can do damage to one or both parties, physical damage or psychological damage. One party can leave feeling defeated or demeaned, and the winning party is going to pay something for that later on. It also, within an organization, increases the distance sometimes between people who really need each other, and there's a cost to be picked up there. It can lead to a climate of distrust and game playing, because I don't want to let you know what's going on inside of me. You'll take advantage of me, and I withhold information, and you withhold information, and if we need to work together, or our departments need to work together, that can cause some real problems. And in effect, I don't use your resources and you don't use my resources. Now, those are some clear negative things.
I'm interested in hearing about the positive, too, because I'm sure that some people would be a little bit skeptical about seeing conflict as a positive force.
Yeah, but in our experience, if you think about it, first of all, conflict really forces you to clarify what it is you want. It clarifies your thinking. if nobody argues with me, I can get away with some fairly sloppy and casual ideas. But if somebody pushes back against me, I have to really sharpen up and give examples of what I'm talking about. Sometimes conflict forces us to look for new approaches. You know, I don't like your approach, you don't like my approach, so but we got to do something. So it may force us to find a third way, which is better. Conflict is also useful because it is sometimes the trigger that helps us see a problem which has been lying there a long time, draining energy from the system, and it's never been bad enough for us to attend to. But a conflict erupts, and we've got to do something about it. And so we fix something that should have been fixed long before. Conflict creates a certain tension. There's a certain level of tension in an organization that makes it more creative, more productive. We used to think that the best organization was one that's very relaxed and easygoing, and that is not necessarily true.
It really depends on the type of organization, too, doesn't it, Warren?
That's right.
Some organizations need more conflict than others.
That's right. That's right. If in those organizations either conflict is the tension is too low or gets excessively high, you have problems. If tension gets too high, then people become defensive and anxious, and it limits their thinking about alternatives.
Are there some reasons why conflict is increasing in organizational life?
Yeah, I think several reasons. First of all, we keep saying we're living in turbulent times, which means all sorts of things are changing. Now, the more things change, the more reason there is for different people to feel differently about the direction of change and the pace of change. And I think we're also discovering more openness in organizations, so more people are free to express their views regardless of where they sit in the organizational hierarchy. And the more openness you have, the more conflict you're going to have.
Warren, is the increasing number of specialists in organization raising the level of organizational conflict? For example, the rise in the number of specialists seems to be shifting traditional authority patterns away from the position-based authority of the manager or executive to the knowledge-based authority of the specialist. Is this having an impact on the level of organizational conflict?
It certainly can. The studies have shown generally that the more there's a gap between position authority, as you say, and expert authority, the more likely that conflict will increase. Because the people who sit there with the knowledge and who feel unappreciated or something of that sort are likely to withhold knowledge or to misuse it. And the people who have the official authority sometimes don't like to indicate their dependence on those experts. And different kinds of tensions can occur between those two groups of people.
Yeah, which complicates the negotiations that have to go on between, say, a manager and his subordinates who are specialists.
Absolutely.
You know, Warren, we really haven't defined conflict yet. What is conflict?
Well,
what are its sources?
I think of conflict as a process that begins when two or more parties believe that their goals are incompatible. And when you're talking about parties, that can be two individuals or two groups or two organizations or two nations. But if you kind of unpack that experience of conflict, a conflict episode, you come up with ingredients like this, that the first experience one has is one of frustration. That is, I begin to feel that either you are blocking me or you're going to block me from getting something that I want. And that can be any kind of a goal and can be clear or not clear to me. But I feel that if you get what you want, I'm not going to get what I want. So there's some kind of a frustration feeling. And then I move immediately, and this is just in split seconds, to a kind of a conceptualization of what's going on here. I ask myself very quickly, what is the issue at stake, and how important is this to me, and why is he doing this to me, and so on. And I form some picture in my mind about what the conflict is. On the basis of that conceptualization, and by the way, that's the best place where I have a chance to get some leverage on the direction of the conflict. After that conceptualization, then I take action. I say something to you, or I do something that affects you, and then we're off to the races. Because when I act, you probably react. And on the basis of your reaction, I reconceptualize what's going on, maybe becoming more rigid in my original picture, or maybe changing it, and then I act and you react and so on. And we go round and round that circle until finally there's an outcome.
It sets up, it sounds like conflict becomes cyclical in nature.
That's right.
Unless there's some type of intervention.
That's right.
Let me clarify one point in my mind. You mentioned that during the conceptualization stage, that's the best point in which to gain leverage to deal with the conflict. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. Because we can define, it's at the conceptualization stage that we begin to define the issues. And there are some ways you can define issues which make it clearly a win-lose situation. If there are two programs on television, and we've only got one television set, we can't have your program and my program on at the same time. So if the issue is framed as, whose program are we going to watch, somebody wins and somebody loses. Mm-hmm. Now, if we frame the question as a statement as, now let's see, you would like to watch program X, and I would like to watch program Y, then there are other options. There are other television sets in the world, for example, the neighbors and so forth. But if it's going to be, is it going to be channel 7 or channel 4? It can only be one. Mary Follett used the illustration of two people sitting in the library, one of them by the window, and the person and another person sitting more in the center of the room. And they couldn't agree on whether that window should be up or down, because the person sitting by the window didn't want the draft, and the person sitting farther in the room wanted the cool air. So if you define the issue as, is that window going to be up or down, you can't solve it.
Right.
But when you find out what it is people really are, makes people feel uncomfortable, then it was obvious they could solve the problem.
Dr. Schmidt has given us a useful way of examining conflict by seeing it as a series of events or episodes. By understanding that pattern and by unpacking it, negotiators increase their leverage to direct the course of that conflict. Let's take a closer look at each stage and specifically where we can gain that leverage. Event number 1 is frustration, when a person or a group feels blocked from reaching a goal or meeting its needs. I can feel frustrated when you prevent me from getting the resources I need. I can feel frustrated when you don't agree with me. I can feel frustrated when you try to attack or undermine me. Now, I may not express those feelings for a number of reasons. I may fear you won't understand or be sympathetic, and that will increase the frustration. Or I may fear that expressing my anger can lead to some type of retribution. Another reason may be that there are some unwritten rules between us, or in the organization, or at the bargaining table, that these feelings shouldn't be expressed, that they're inappropriate, or even a sign of weakness. Another reason, time constraints. A need to complete a task or reach a settlement can cause me to hide the feelings so that we can finish the task. Now, if these frustrations aren't brought out, there's a good chance they will come out later in the negotiation, either as anger, intimidation, or manipulation. They can also cause us a great deal of stress, which can block us from doing our best in a negotiation. So a first step in managing conflict is to identify these feelings of anger, helplessness, vulnerability in ourselves or in the other person, and ask ourselves why we or the other person feels frustrated, and by doing that, gain some leverage by having the option of using some type of intervention to bring the feelings out into the open and deal with them, or to block the expression of the feelings until there's a better time for dealing with them. But again, if these feelings become intense, they can eventually block negotiations. In many cases, the real issues in a negotiation are not the substance of the issues, but the feelings of hostility and the damage to somebody's pride. The second event in a typical conflict is the conceptualization stage, where we lay out the issues as a reaction to our frustrations. To re-emphasize Warren's point, it's at this stage where we have the greatest opportunity for gaining leverage to manage the conflict. We can define the issue as either I win, you lose, or as a problem we can solve to our mutual satisfaction or through a compromise. Warren's illustration of the library windows and the television sets, for example, pointed out that if a conflict is stated in either-or terms, it sets up a win-lose conflict. As he showed, the alternative is to state the conflict as a problem, which must be solved to meet the needs of both parties. Another example, take the situation of a group of staff specialists trying to introduce a new production method to a group of line managers who are resisting the change. If the proposal is presented as whether to use the old or the new method, it's very likely the result will be a typical staff line confrontation. However, if both the staff and line managers sit down to discuss the problem of increasing production, then it sets the stage for searching for a variety of solutions to meet this problem. So gaining leverage in the conceptualization stage is making the choice of how to define the issue. It's also a matter of choosing which issues to raise. Some issues can be resolved to the mutual gain of both parties. Some can only be settled through compromise, and some conflicts are so intense that they can only be resolved through a win-lose confrontation. Knowing which issues to raise in a negotiation, how to define that issue, and timing when to raise an issue are all critical aspects of gaining leverage. Event number 3 in the typical pattern of conflict is the behavior or the give-and-take dynamics in negotiations. One action by a negotiator leads to reactions by the other party, and a pattern of escalation or de-escalation follows. Gaining leverage to manage conflict at this stage requires being sensitive to when conflict is escalating, being able to diagnose the differences, and then choosing a negotiating strategy and using a variety of collaboration, bargaining, and persuasion skills and techniques. Event number 4 is the outcome of the conflict. Gaining leverage at this stage involves looking at how things are at the conclusion of the conflict. which includes looking at the quality of the decisions reached or the actions taken and the quality of the relationship between the two parties. Did both parties feel they got something out of the negotiations? Did some creative solutions emerge? Was a good relationship maintained as a foundation for future negotiations? Is the settlement stable, and will it be implemented by both parties? The leverage gained is essentially learning from our experience, what did we do right or wrong, as a way of asking ourselves how to improve our effectiveness in future negotiations. Now let's take a closer look at a critical step in negotiating conflict, the need to accurately define the differences between the parties. In the interview, Dr. Schmidt presents a way of diagnosing different types of conflict and an example of an intervention used to negotiate and resolve an organizational conflict. Warren, you've indicated that it's important to understand conflict, but what do you really mean by that? How do we understand the nature of conflict?
Well, I think that you begin with a couple of diagnostic questions. Whenever a difference occurs between two parties, one important question to ask, it seems to me, is what is the nature of the difference between us? Where are we together and where are we apart? And secondly, what might be the reasons for our having that difference? When you think about what is the nature of the difference, I think you immediately begin to recognize that people can differ over four things. We can differ over facts. You have a different impression of what the problem is or the situation is than I do. And so naturally, you want to move in a different direction than I do. Sometimes we may agree on the problem or the situation, but disagree as to the best way to handle it. You want to follow action X and I want to follow action Y. Sometimes our differences are over goals, which are the desired state of affairs. And sometimes our differences are over values, which are the very long-term kinds of goals. Now, very often you find people who have a common picture of the problem, really share the same values, and would like the same outcomes, but they differ in the best way to get there. Mm-hmm. But they never narrow that down sufficiently to understand their areas of agreement. So they begin talking past each other and generating anger against each other, so that they end up with an escalating kind of conflict. They begin to actually see the other party as standing for fundamentally different goals and values than is the case.
Is it true then, Warren, that unless we spend the time and energy to clarify the nature and extent of the differences in a conflict situation, the likelihood of the conflict escalating is increased?
That's right. They start acting against each other in their tone of voice and so on, so that they really never clarify the issues. I think we've all seen situations where people are really going at each other in an argument, and a third person listens to that and says, "My God, it seems to me that both of you are saying exactly the same thing in different words, but neither is listening to them." I spent some time in Northern Ireland a couple of years ago, where they know something about conflict. Yes. And that conflict has been going on, as you know, for so many years now, that there have been so many layers of issues piled on top of each other. And both sides have done such horrendous things to people on the other side that I couldn't find anybody over there who was hopeful about being able to resolve that problem. And this is what happens when you haven't taken the time to sort out where you're together and where you're apart.
You've mentioned those four sources of differences, four types of differences in conflict situations. Are any one of those differences more often the source of conflict than others, or are any of them more often the sources of more intense conflict than others? For example, I would imagine that conflicts over differences in values might be more intense types of conflicts.
That's correct. If a conflict is defined in people's minds as a difference over values, then you have the most difficult kind to resolve. And that's the sort of thing we experienced during World War II with the Nazis, for example. We just could not tolerate the kinds of things that they stood for.
Warren, I get the impression that quite often in conflict situations, we often assume that the cause of the conflict is fundamental differences in values, but in looking at it more closely, there is more often a commonality in values, and the major differences are over perceptions of facts and means.
I think you're absolutely right that with most of the conflicts we deal with in our ordinary lives, in the same culture particularly, we have so much more in common than we have difference. And our values are very, very similar. And our major differences are in the area of the facts and the methods.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you see, even in the same organization, there are traditional conflicts between the sales department and the production department, and the sales department makes a big case for more flexible production schedules, and people ought to be able to get rush out orders out because they're important, and the production people are interested in having a smooth flow of things so that they can make the product economically. But somewhere along the line, they both have to see their common goal in that bottom line that the company has. Mm-hmm. And but it's easy to overlook that sometimes. We get locked into narrow goals, which are really methods to achieve other goals where we would find greater commonality if we looked.
You've been a consultant to many organizations, haven't you, Warren?
That's right.
And can you give us an example of a situation where there was some conflict, where you applied some of these diagnostic methods in helping people understand the nature of their differences, which has helped resolve that conflict constructively?
Well, I can think of one company that it's an international company that produces some electronic equipment. And they have offices all around the world, and in each office they have a sales manager and a service manager. And they were experiencing continual tension and conflict between these two kinds of people all around the world. So they brought them together to see if some of this could be alleviated, some of this destructiveness that goes on between the people who sell a contract to a client and sometimes overpromise what kind of service they'll get, and the service people who then have to pick up where the salespeople leave off. Okay, so we brought all these people together for a day, and we went through this kind of series of exercises. Step one, we had the service managers get together in one room, the sales managers get together in another room. Ask each of them to begin writing on large sheets of paper what it was that the other people did that created problems for them, the bug list.
Mm-hmm.
And then before they came together, we asked each one to predict what was on the other group's list. They came together and shared these concerns, clarified some of the misperceptions, and then Step 2 was to begin to think positively, for each group to go back and think about what is it those other people could do that would help us do our job better. So in effect, they wrote almost memos to each other, "We wish you would do X." This was shared. Then each group took the opposite group's list. That is, the sales managers took the service people's requests, and their job was to say, under what circumstances could we do what you want us to do? And they found that they could accommodate some of these things, and this was shared. And it was then against this background that the pairs of colleagues from around the world met to think about which of these things they could implement and how they could build their relationship in the office where they worked together. And the final thing was these pairs coming back together and sharing what they were going to do. So you see, what we were trying to do is, first of all, make it as comfortable as possible for people to express all of the gripes they have, and then to begin to work them together.
Mm-hmm.
That's the sort of thing.
It sounded like during that process they found some commonality in terms of goals and values, and we're really focusing on the methods by which to accomplish those goals and values.
That's right. That's right. They began to see each other as parts of the same organization rather than those guys and us guys.
Another critical element for managing conflict is being able to perceive it, which in the heat of battle may be more difficult than it sounds. If we're able to notice at what point conflict begins to escalate, we're in a better position to notice what triggered the escalation, and as a result gain leverage by finding out what the real or hidden differences are. Many of these signs are overt. For example, we can see increasing defensiveness and competition between the parties as they increasingly shift to a win-lose orientation. Rather than listening and trying to understand, there's increasing suspiciousness and hostility. Often the issue gets lost in the conflict, and the main objective becomes a desire for total victory. Another sign is self-righteousness and rationalization, as each party tries to justify their actions to themselves or a constituency to make themselves look as good as possible. Another sign of increasingly destructive conflict is when the parties, rather than focusing on one issue and trying to get it resolved, start bringing up new issues, with the result that both parties lose sight of the original issue and get sidetracked and increasingly confused and frustrated. A final sign of escalating conflict is when it starts becoming personalized, when there's a lack of tact and concern for the other person's feelings. There's a lack of any gesture of conciliation or willingness to listen to the anger and frustration of the other person. Again, being sensitive to what triggered an escalation provides a way of identifying what's really important to the other person. However, there are many times when these signs are more subtle, when feelings of anger, frustration, or hostility are presented either non-verbally, through body language or gestures, or through cliches or phrases that have hidden meanings or feelings attached to them. I asked Hank Calero how gaining an understanding of nonverbal communications and the hidden meaning behind common expressions can help negotiators perceive whether conflict is escalating or de-escalating.
Well, Ed, you know, you just touched on a subject of mine that I could talk all day long on. I mean, you've been talking about my love and the whole flow of negotiation, but now you get into one specific area that I'm enamored with, and that's the area of nonverbal communications. So first I'll answer that by talking about the nonverbal verbal aspects. we find, as Darwin found so many years ago, that when individuals are interacting, when they're involved, when they're concerned, they tend to lean towards each other. That is, the posturally, standing or sitting. I mean, this is even true of two individuals that are eyeball to eyeball, about ready to start swinging at each other, isn't it true?
Yes, they're involved.
Right, sure. So when people are, shall we say, in the involved leading up to the commitment, when they're in the buy mode, as a salesman might call it, they tend to lean towards each other. And this might be with expressions, they lean towards my suggestion, they're getting close together, come from. And conversely, when they're turned off, when they're non-supportive, when they're not interested, when they're don't really care, they tend to take positions where they move themselves from each other, or they're further apart, as the expression. They turn their backs or turn away from each other. We lean towards when we're involved, getting committed, ready to buy, oftentimes ready to terminate situations. And we tend to move away when we're less interested, less concerned. So then there are a lot of other minute gestural clues. Individuals that are very tense or angry or anxious, worried, concerned, frightened, their blink rate goes up, as we mentioned earlier. They also tend to clear the throat more often. They tend to wet their lips more often. Their breath rate is greater. Maybe that's where the expression letting off steam comes from. If there's water nearby, and I'd recommend that negotiators always have a pitcher of water and glasses. If there's water nearby, they tend to go to the water because of irritation, and they take what we call little irritation sips. Rather than drinking water, as you and I did recently when we were getting thirsty, you take a good healthy swig of the water, which fills up a third or quarter capacity of your mouth. So these are some of the signs non-verbally that tell you people are moving towards a way. Another very, very important one, which took me several years to acknowledge and several more years to get an understanding for, is the greater the conflict, the greater the separation of the bodies, the more the people have their legs crossed, the more the people have their legs crossed in conflict, in separation. And the more agreeable people are, the more they're ready to accept, the more return, the more the legs are uncrossed. Now, I was in a quandary for several years trying to understand why so many negotiators, when they're in the acceptance or termination phase, they're ready to nail down a deal, I'll take it, or they're ready to say, forget it, I've been a waste of time, or when they say, well, basically I like the idea, I'll have to sleep on it, those three basic areas. Those individuals tend not to have their legs crossed. And for several years I wondered why, and the answer is so damn simple. Just visualize, if you're sitting with your legs crossed, and your arms crossed or whatever, and you want to get up.
You can't get up.
You can't get up. You got to uncross your legs. And you still can't get up with your upper torso to the back of the chair. Your upper torso has to come forward so that you can get the center of gravity in a position where we're designed to stand. And then lastly, they give you all the subtle little clues like put their hands on the knees, or they put their hands on the edge of the conference table or office desk, which is where the expression shove off and push off no doubt come from. And then lastly, sometimes they orient their body so that they point right towards an exit. And those are some of the clues that can tell you that people are escalating or de-escalating the feelings. Non-verbally.
Hank, in your book, Metatalk, you point out that certain phrases may indicate feelings or attitudes that, if recognized, might be useful to a negotiator. Would you give us some examples of these?
Yes, in Metatalk, we strongly emphasize that Metatalk, of course, is part of our whole environment, but especially true at the negotiating table. When individuals say things like, it's not the money, it's the principle, it's almost always the money. And when they say they wouldn't do it for $1 million, they'd do it for a hell of a lot less. And so we look for Metatalk for those things when people say, oh, by the way, before I forget, and incidentally. Those are usually very, very important things. And the individual, oftentimes, that uses those terms is about ready to reveal or say something of importance to that person. So listen carefully. They may be that, oh, by the way, before I forget, may be willing a disclosure of information, which is very vital. So listen, and be willing to build on it, and also remember that the more experienced a negotiator is, the more he understands incremental disclosure. So he's testing you. Oh, by the way, there is a possibility we might save some additional money on that particular project, and that's all you're going to get this time. You got to be prepared to massage it and say, oh, is that right? Specifically where? Well, in the area of material costs, I think we might be able to reduce the cost. And you still don't get the whole thing. It isn't until about your fourth or fifth or sixth question that you finally get it out that you're going to save money in the structural steel because he's going to buy it from other this type of thing. And then exactly how much he's going to save.
Hank, are there some ways of double-checking these nonverbal clues in the negotiations?
We call this an anti-assumption device. Again, since words are only labels, I think our meaning are the same. How can we read one or two signs and then test them to make sure that we're correct, we're on the right track, we're aware enough to perceive the right thing? Well, we talk about anti-assumption devices. When people have strong feelings, and indeed, nonverbal communications is simply feeling transmission. That's all it is. Transmission of a person's feelings. So when a person transmits his feelings, they transmit in a variety of ways. For example, oftentimes when people cross their arms in a negotiation, they are taking very firm, fixed positions. Oftentimes when people cross their arms, they're saying, don't bother me with facts, I've made up my mind. Often when they cross their arms, they're saying, I don't want to hear any more about it. Subject is closed, and on and on. But there are other things besides the crossing of the arms that give you this. You will notice how oftentimes they get their back up. And that's where that expression comes from. You will also notice that their head tends to go to right angles. And you'll also notice that as their head goes to right angles, their chin goes up rather than chin down. You will also notice that when they cross their arms, they also tend to make fists and shove them underneath their armpits. Now, if you're sitting and negotiating with a guy that has the arms crossed, the head is right angles, the shoulders, his chin is up, and he's looking down his nose at you, his back is up.
He's not ready to shake your hand.
That's right. So you better try something differently. Do something different. Give him something to read. Ask him a question. Go up to a blackboard and get him involved by handing him the chalk. In order to take the chalk, he's got to uncross his arms. And if you can get him to the blackboard, as most negotiators know, negotiations standing up don't last as long as those that are sitting down.